One of the coolest things that's going on right now is we've had some advances in DNA technology where a lot of cold cases are being solved. And I want to go back to a cold case from the 1990s that was only recently solved. This was the case of the murder of Freddie Laster, and it took decades before his killer was finally brought to justice. Let's get into it. Hi y'all, to my subscribers, welcome back. Thank you so much for spending time with me. You're the reason I make these videos. If you're new here, my name is Delaney and I'm a true crime writer and all-around murder nerd. On this channel, I talk about some of the sickest cases. And I tend to cuss a lot, so if you're into that sort of thing, go ahead and subscribe. If not, that's cool, you do you. I know we've been going back to the 80s for a while now. It's just such a target-rich environment. But for today's case, we're going back to the 90s. Early in the morning of July 5th, 1994, a woman was walking her dog by a gas station in Lake City, Florida, when she spotted what she thought was a mannequin next to a dumpster. Fun fact, it's never a mannequin. So she called the cops, and when they got there, what they found was a partially decomposed human torso, missing its head, hands, and legs. Inside the dumpster, they found several clues covered in blood. A red flannel shirt, 2 knives, a pair of orange gloves, a flower-shaped bathtub decal, and an egg crate-style mattress topper. The torso, which had apparently been washed clean, was only able to be identified as belonging to a white male between the ages of 16 and 19, probably with sandy blonde hair. But there were no missing persons reports that matched that description. And since so much of the remains were missing, the medical examiner couldn't determine a specific cause of death. But obviously he didn't dismember himself, so the manner of death was clearly homicide. And the fact that the killer had gone to such gruesome lengths to hide the victim's identity suggested that the killer might be someone who knew the victim or had some connection to him. Anyway, during the investigation, a witness stated that they had seen a gray Chevy Camaro backed up next to that dumpster earlier that morning, but they didn't see the tag or who was driving it. So that was all they had to go on. Who this young man was or who might have killed him remained a mystery. 7 months later and about an hour away, Daisy Laster went to the Duval County, Florida Sheriff's Office to report her twin brother, Fred Laster, missing. She said no one had heard from Freddie since June of the previous year. Now, that might seem like an awfully long time not to hear from a 16-year-old family member, but you have to understand the Laster kids didn't exactly have the typical home life. Years earlier, their mother had died, and their father basically abandoned them to go live with his new wife. The kids were left pretty much on their own until their grandmother had taken them in and struggled to support them on her Social Security check. But despite all that chaos, the Laster kids had stayed close, and it wasn't like Freddie to go so long without contacting anyone. They didn't have much more information to give the sheriff's office, except that the last time they'd heard from him, he was with his, quote, foster father and former youth pastor, Ronnie Leon Hyde. The Lasters had met Hyde through the Strength for Living Baptist Church in Ocean Way, Florida. And okay, this doesn't have anything to do with the story, but y'all, I have to tell you about this church. It was founded by Ed and Betty Stallnecker, who were sort of traveling musical revival preachers. Betty actually was a classically trained singer, and the pair had regular feature appearances at the National Southern Baptist Conference for like 2 decades. In the 80s, they settled down in Ocean Way, Florida, where they set up the Strength for Living Church. They also hosted a cable access show called Do You Believe? Ed was kind of known as a controversial pastor. He smoked and drank and even allowed smoking in the church. Lots of locals thought this guy was sketchy and even compared the couple to Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. Supposedly, the ministry for Strength for Living Church was aimed at helping low-income youth, which is probably why Hyde was attracted to it. More on that later. The deal was people could donate their old boats to the church as a tax write-off, and then Stallnecker would teach the kids how to work on the boats and then sell them and use the funds to help the kids. Except he never did any of that. The whole thing was a scam. And as investigators started looking into that scam, they discovered that the entire church was literally built on a scam. It seems Ed Stallnecker had run a Ponzi scheme where he took $300,000 in investments from retirees in Miami. But instead of actually investing the money, he'd used it to build the Strength for Living church. He was arrested in 1995 and charged with forgery, but I couldn't find any records about if he was ever convicted or spent any time in jail. He died in 2007, but Betty is alive and remarried. She was recently inducted into the Southern Baptist Convention's Hall of Faith for her singing career. Anyway, this is the church where Hyde served as the youth pastor and played in the band. At the same time, he was also working and volunteering at several other organizations, mostly church-related, that tried to help troubled, abused, and homeless youth. But Hyde didn't actually have any qualifications to be a pastor or a counselor. At that time, all he had was a background as a corrections officer and a degree in psychology from the University of North Florida. Besides his work with these organizations, he would also take in homeless and troubled young people, like the Lasters. When the Lasters first met him sometime in the late 80s, he was living behind the church in the Stallnecker's old converted tour bus with a teenager he'd taken in named Danny. But not long after the Lasters met him, Danny apparently moved out and was never seen or heard from again. Anyway, it was the church's music program that had attracted Freddie. Freddie played guitar and wrote songs, and pretty soon he started playing in the church band with Hyde. Hyde had seemed to take a special liking to the Laster kids. He often gave their grandmother money and other help since she was trying to support 6 kids just on her Social Security check. He would also come by and pick them all up to take them to church in his gray Chevy Camaro. Later, after he inherited a house in Jacksonville Beach from his father, he would take them there to spend the weekend with him. The Laster kids spent a lot of time with him, especially at first Travis, who basically moved in with him when he was about 12 or 13 and stayed with him through high school until he left to join the Coast Guard. Around the same time, Freddie moved in with him as well, and once Travis left, Freddie sort of became Hyde's favorite. Freddie's cousin John Kirkland, who was close with the Lasters and attended the Strength for Living church with them, said that Hyde would take Freddie for these big weekend getaways like sci-fi conventions and buy him expensive clothes and toys. And he didn't do that for any of the other family members. Hyde would even declare Freddie his foster son on his taxes, even though he had not gone through the legal process of becoming a foster parent. He also declared the other Laster kids as dependents because of all the money and support he was giving to their grandmother. Right. When she reported Freddie missing, Daisy told police that as far as she knew, Hyde was the last person that Freddie was with. But Hyde was never questioned. Several months later, Hyde ran into Travis and told him that he'd last seen Freddie sometime in June. He said that Freddie had jumped out of his car when they were along a deserted, heavily wooded part of the highway because he hadn't wanted to go back to his grandmother's house. So time went by and the 2 cases, the unidentified torso in Columbia County and Fred Laster's missing persons case in Duval County, both went cold. At some point, Freddie's missing persons case was accidentally purged from the state's database. Hyde continued claiming Freddie as his foster son on his taxes. He went on to earn his master's in counselor education in 1998 and became a licensed counselor, enabling him to continue helping troubled young people. He also continued taking in homeless and abused boys. Meanwhile, DNA technology continued to improve. So in 2010, the Columbia County Sheriff's Office resubmitted that bloody shirt that was found at the crime scene for DNA testing. The testing found it was the victim's blood on the shirt as well as that of a second person, but that second person couldn't be identified. In 2012, the case was assigned to a new detective. The following year, that detective contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children for help with the case. But remember, Freddie's missing persons file had been deleted from the state's database. So the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children created a flyer and a web page for the unidentified torso, showing the shirt and the decal to hopefully jog someone's memory on this now 20-year-old cold case. It must have worked, because in September of 2015, some of Freddie's family members came to the Columbia County Sheriff's Office because they believed that the John Doe in the flyer might be their brother Freddie. They again emphasized that the last person who was seen with him was Hyde, and they said that over the years, Hyde had given them different stories about the last time he'd seen Freddie. Daisy, Freddie's twin sister, submitted her DNA to compare to the remains found near the dumpster, and a few months later, the results came back. The remains were those of Fred Laster. So police started looking at Ronnie Hyde. They found out that Hyde had been flagged in 2012 in a Canadian child PORN sting, but that sting had identified literally hundreds of suspects in multiple countries, so it hadn't been followed up on. So police began surveilling Hyde, and in 2016, they were able to snag some used nasal swabs out of his trash. That DNA was confirmed as the second contributor on that flannel shirt, and was matched to a hair on one of the gloves and blood on the knives. As the prosecutor would later put it, Hyde's DNA was all over that dumpster. On March 7, 2017, Ronnie Leon Hyde was arrested for the murder of Fred Laster. Hyde was 60 at the time and was working as a mental health counselor at a church in Nocatee, Florida. But police would soon discover that Hyde had a lot more crimes to answer for. When they went to search Hyde's house, it was nearly impossible to process it. The house and yard had been completely hoarded with junk, trash, papers, you name it. Investigators stated that the house had a foul stench that could be smelled for blocks away. The walls were covered in mold, the ceiling was caved in, and there were rat turds everywhere. There was also no running water, so apparently Hyde had been using the bathtub as a toilet. The neighbors had been complaining to the city about it for decades. Anyway, backhoes were brought in to dig up the yard in the hopes of finding the rest of Freddie's remains, or possibly other victims. Unfortunately, the only thing they found were a bunch of animal bones. But inside the house, they did find a bathtub with decals matching the one found with Freddie's remains. They found stacks of Hyde's journals going back for decades that all contained very incriminating information. And there were boxes of newspaper clippings about murdered children. They also found 2 hard drives that were full of images of child sexual abuse. Now, in addition to the murder charges, he was charged with dozens of counts of child PORN. Not long after the search was completed, the city declared the house a health hazard and tore it down. Now, knowing Hyde's long history of working with young people and the information found in the journals, investigators believed there had to be more victims out there. So the FBI put up billboards all around the Jacksonville area asking any other victims to please come forward. The tip line was flooded with calls. A lot of them were from former coworkers and neighbors describing Hyde being super creepy, like him talking about lying in bed with teenage boys in his underwear, or how he would go to the YMCA just to creep on naked boys in the shower. Ugh. But more importantly, some former victims did come forward. Travis, Freddie's older brother who had lived with Hyde before, told investigators that Hyde had sexually assaulted him for years. 2 other victims who haven't been named contacted the tip line to say Hyde had sexually assaulted them multiple times, starting from when they were about 12 up until they were about 16. The attacks happened between 1986 and 1994, which would overlap with the time when Freddie was living with him and probably being assaulted by him too. These victims told investigators that Hyde would lure them in with alcohol, guns, and other gifts. which tracks with the way Hyde treated Freddie and is the textbook definition of grooming. Because words have meanings. Anyway, Hyde would then escalate to the abuse by claiming he was educating them. The victim said that he would show the boys adult porn films and then would use a camcorder to record himself abusing the boys. But that's not all. There were at least 2 other boys who had lived with Hyde who had just seemingly disappeared. One of the unnamed victims corroborated some of Hyde's journal entries about another boy who was only known as Joey, who was on the autism spectrum and is believed to have been assaulted by Hyde during the mid-'80s. No one knows what happened to him. There was also Danny, who'd been living with him in the bus, but who'd just up and disappeared one day. No one knows his real name or what might have happened to him either. Investigators have said that there are more than a half dozen cases where Ronnie Hyde might be, quote, potentially relevant. One in particular is the disappearance of Mark Degner and Brian Hayes, who were 12 and 13, respectively. The boys left Paxton Middle School together in February of 2005 and were never seen again. The boys' school was only about 8 miles away from Hyde's second home in Jacksonville. And while there doesn't seem to be any evidence tying the boys' disappearance to him, it is mighty suspicious. Apparently, the FBI is also looking at him for the murder of 11-year-old Dallas Green in 1988. I'll be keeping an eye on this and let you know if there's any more developments. Anyway, the trials for the murder and the CP were split into 2, and Hyde went to trial for Laster's murder in late March of 2022. He actually took the stand in his own defense, which was not a good look for him. He was arrogant, condescending, and frequently talked over the prosecutor. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty. His mandatory sentence is life in prison without parole. I haven't heard when the trial for the CP is, not that it matters much at this point, but I just can't believe that Freddie was the only boy he murdered. And this is just speculation, but hear me out. You don't just commit murder and dismember the corpse out of nowhere and then never do it again. That's not the kind of thing you do as a one-off. This piece of shit was a patient, calculating predator. He studied for years to be able to have free access to victims, and he knew just which ones to target. He'd been working with and abusing troubled kids for decades. Kids like Danny or Joey, who didn't have anyone looking for them when they went missing. I think he probably disposed of their remains and maybe others in the swamps or somewhere where they'll never be found. Now, I don't know why Freddie's murder was different. We still haven't found his head, hands, or legs, which makes me think that maybe Hyde was interrupted before he could finish disposing of everything. And for whatever reason, he felt he just had to get rid of it quickly. And for fuck's sake, if the Duval County Sheriff had done even a little follow-up on Freddie's disappearance, not only would he have been identified right away, but Hyde could have been stopped. But we'll probably never know. Hyde's in his 60s now and continues to claim he's innocent. If you suspect a child is being abused, please contact your state's DHS or call the national hotline number on the screen. One call could save a life. What do you think about this case or about Ronnie Hyde potentially having more victims? Let me know in the comments. And be sure to like, subscribe, all that stuff. Till next time, Darklings.